Welcome to another inspiring episode of the Elite Expert Insider Podcast. Hosts Melanie Johnson and Jen Foster are the owners of Elite Online Publishing. They're both Wall Street Journal, USA Today bestselling authors. We're really glad you're here because this podcast was designed for you. Meet industry experts that share their secrets and strategies. Get successful results for your business in money, relationships, health, and your life. Each episode is going to inspire you to take action towards reaching your greatness.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, how are you doing? We are publishers and we're often asked how to market your book. That's the biggest question we get all the time. I had an author yesterday saying, I thought it was going to be hard to write my book and get it published. The hardest part is to market my book. So today we thought we'd ask, podcast or not to podcast? So those are the questions. So there's a couple different answers for that. Should you be a podcaster, start your own podcast when you're an author, or should you be on other people's podcast? So Jen, you found some answers when you went to PodFest just last week.
Yeah, so I went down to Orlando and visited PodFest and a video conference, VidCon, and the podcast festival, PodFest. And I learned so many awesome things. It was a 4-day conference. But the biggest takeaway I had, Melanie and I have had our podcast for almost 7 years now.
Yeah,
6
7
years. 6 or 7 years. Yeah. So we have a lot of episodes. And, what I realized is I'm not a guest on other people's podcasts enough. That's what I realized. So my biggest takeaway was I need to be interviewed on other people's podcasts more often. Now I'll do a random one here or there. And I think Melanie does more than I do, but we actually forget after we do the interview to actually utilize that and put it on our websites and put it on our social media channels and all of the different places that you can, chop up the video and put that video of you being interviewed on their podcast. So it's really great because it creates all this content, whether you're on for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or an hour.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So one of the first reasons to be on other people's podcasts is it gives you that extra credibility, right? Yeah. You're getting credibility that someone invited you on their show. They think that you have really great content talking about your book, the content of your book. And again, this is geared more towards nonfiction authors, but it can also work for fiction authors as well. So that gives you that credibility, authority that someone asked you to be on there. The second important thing is that you are being introduced to a new audience. So now all of a sudden you've broadened your scope. Instead of just being to your audience, you have captured, kind of hacked their audience and they're being introduced to you. So they may want to buy not just your book, but your products and your services. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing, like Jen said, is that, okay, now you have all this content that you can put it on your social media. You can announce it to your audience that, hey, I'm on this podcast. You can make reels out of it. You can make other social media posts out of it. You can send it out in emails. You can make little bits. You can get quotes from it. So Jen, how do you say, just on the technical part, so if I'm on somebody else's podcast, what do I do the best way to get that content and some of the technology that I should be using to chop it up?
Sure. There's so many different ones to use. First, I want to do a shout out to Diane. She says hello, and she's been thinking about coaching clients on podcasting and getting interviews on other people's podcasts as well. So it is on top of mind for business owners, and it is a really great tool to build your business. It really is, because you can utilize other people's lists. That's what we're talking about when we're saying getting an interview on someone else's podcast, because not only you are going to announce that and share that with your list and your people and your following, but they are going to be sharing it with their list and their people and their following. So you definitely want to utilize other people's podcasts, as well as vice versa, have them on your show, right? If you have a show. So it's very, very good. But yeah, the tools, there's so many great tools out there. I've heard of a lot of different tools, and we actually, of course, learned of a lot while we were there because there were so many booths and things that were really cool to see. We have been using Wave. I don't know if you've heard of Wave. I believe it has 2 A's. So Wave Video, if you look that up, they take your video, if you have a video, and make snippets, or you can use your audio from your podcast and make snippets of your show. We actually just learned about a really cool tool that we're going to be using called Descript, Descript. So Descript. And this is a tool that you can do everything. So it actually edits your audio and video. It also does the snippets, so it will chop it all up. It also takes out your and, ums, and buts, which we have a lot of those, right? So it'll take those out. And it has a couple other things too. But that's a really good one that we learned about. We also signed up for one that was a really good one. I got to think of the name of it.
See,
There's a
there's
bunch of
another
different ones. I'll think of it. I'll think of the other one that we signed up for.
Well, what should we ask for from the podcaster? Like, what format can we get the video? Can we get the raw files? Can we just copy it off of YouTube if they do video? And if it's an audio file, then we have some limitations. Kind of walk us through that.
Yeah. And I want to say hello to everyone watching. So hello. But yeah, so with the video, when you're doing a podcast, they might be recording video, but they might only use the audio, right? So when they produce their podcast, they're just going to have an audio file. If you ask, some podcasters will give you that raw file or that source file. Usually it's edited and it has, all the, bumpers and all that on it, which is really good. Other times they just give you the links. So if you don't have the actual file, they'll just give you links, and the links will go to, the audio that it's sitting somewhere. So you could use most of the places have an embed code. So if say, for instance, it's on Spotify or it's on SoundCloud or it's on iTunes, there's a link that you can use that you can embed an embed code to your website. So that's a way you can put it on there. If they don't give you the files, it's kind of hard to be able to do the snippets of it unless you do screen record or, there's workarounds to it. But I just say hire your tech team and have them do it, right? Get your VA, because those VAs, they know what they're doing, right? Your virtual assistant. So get your VAs and tell them, hey, I was on this podcast. I would like a little snippet of it. Or you can tell them even just the timestamp, right? At 12 minutes and 5 seconds until 13 minutes and 10 seconds. I would like you to take that snippet and then, get that audio for me and put it up with a video or whatever, right? So they can make that little snippet for you.
All right. Well, while you're thinking of the other tech that we just bought, I'm going to give you a ninja trick that we have in our book called Podcasts Authorized: How to Turn Your Podcast into a Book and Your Book into a Podcast. And one of those things is we talked about kind of hacking the other person's list, being exposed to somebody else's list when you're being interviewed on their podcast. And what you should do is give your book away to their audience. So if you just give them a free download of your book, it costs you nothing, right? $0 to do that you can give free downloads away. So, and then all of a sudden you're not just getting exposed to the audience that they're listening to, but then when they send the email out to promote the podcast, they can put the link to give your book away to all of those people. We just had a story yesterday from a friend of ours who 15 years ago had just got his book and he got a speaking gig with it. And he invested in, this was in paperback books at the time, to 400 books for the audience. 15 years later, he got 2 clients just this last month from that book, from that event. So it's kind of the same thing, right? You're going to speak, you're going to be giving your book out, maybe giving it away for free. Another tip is if you want to kind of get the algorithms going for your Amazon account, what you can do is lower the price to your ebook to 99 cents and then buy 100, 500 of them. So $500 investment. And then you can give them away and give those links away through the podcast. And then once they open the link, it counts as a sale. And then it spikes the sales and the algorithms on your Amazon account. And what you're wanting are those people, those exact people that are your niche, that are your customers. So you want to be specific on the podcast that you pick. So you don't want to just be willy-nilly on anybody's podcast. You want to pick podcasts that you can get the audience that you're looking for, your target market. We call it your avatar, that exact person you're looking for, that you want to change their lives and work with them. So Jen, did you think of that software that we just bought?
Yes. So there's a couple different ones that we bought. There was a training course that was really good called Social Boom, which helps you to grow your Instagram followers and get engagement. And then the other one is called Pod in a Box. And you can go check it out. Pod in a Box does a lot of different things, but it's mostly talking with other people and basically engaging with your podcast listeners. So if that kind of makes sense, it does a lot of other things too, but that's kind of the purpose of Pod in a Box, is to talk to and engage with your listeners. So, during your podcast, you can have a survey, you could have a giveaway, you could have a bonus, and then they could go and fill out that survey and you can get their feedback. You can also have them on your show, have them ask questions, and then you shout out to them and ask them a question on your show. So there's lots of ways to engage your audience, and Pod in a Box helps you do that.
All right, so we've talked a lot about being on other people's podcasts. Let's talk about, should you have your own podcast?
Yeah.
So what are the advantages of having your own podcast? So we just think you get out there, you get material. We like to do it every week. So we have a podcast every week. We record it though one time a month for time saving. So we do all of these all at once. We've got a friend of ours, Mario Ficini. I always love shouting out Mario. We'll put a hashtag Mario Ficini in here. He decided to get into podcasting and he recorded 300 episodes back to back to back to back. And he just poof, had them all. And then he was putting them right in. And it really gives you that extra credibility and authority again when you do it. And if you're doing it for your book, you're like, well, what am I going to talk about? Should I have guests? Should I not have guests? So one of the things is you can do it either way. So if you're like, I just don't even know how to get started, I don't know what to do for my content, the best thing to do is deconstruct your book. Go chapter by chapter. You can make probably several episodes for each chapter, right? You're talking about something specific. You're telling the stories. You can do like a Q&A. You could have a friend on that's going to ask you questions about your book. And then I love it if you have interviews. It's a real foot in the door. So if you're talking about leadership, for example, if your book is about leadership or sales or consulting, then bring on people that you would want to be your clients as guests to say, what are you looking for when you hire a consultant? What's the most important thing? And then you're unraveling what you have in your book. So it's really that same thing. And it's going to give you that extra edge and more content. What do you think, Jen?
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I've actually had quite a few of our authors create a podcast from their book. I remember back in the very beginning, we even had a fiction author who did a podcast. Now you're saying, well, how could a fiction author use a podcast? Because you thought, right now we're talking about business podcasts, right? Well, it was to grow his audience for his readers. So he actually had someone come on, interview him about the book. There's so many questions you can ask an author, not just about the characters in the book and the story in the book, but how did you write the book? How did you come up with the characters? With this character, how did you develop that character? There's so many questions. And he just did, I think it was 6 or 7 series, so 7 episodes. And it still lives on YouTube. It still lives on iTunes. It still lives on all the other platforms that the podcast is on. And now when anyone goes and reads the book Horse Angels, it's right there, right? So they can go and
we didn't even
listen
talk
to the author.
So think about when you create these podcasts, another great place to put it is when you're an author on Amazon, you get an Amazon author page. And on that page, you can click to an RSS feed right through the Amazon author page. So just to back up, an Amazon author page is very similar to like a Facebook page, but it's only for authors. The SEO is off the hook. It's so strong that it's going to show up in the top 5 of search for your name when you have it populated. So you're going to put the RSS feed, which is a link directly to your podcast. And every week it updates with the new podcast when you go on there because it's already automatic. So you don't even have to think about it. It's a no-brainer. Anyone who follows you there is going to automatically get a notification. Hey, there's a new podcast. Hey, look at this Amazon author page. So they're getting updated. So you're getting SEO for free. That's another advantage of that.
Yeah, you definitely want an author page if you're an author, and you definitely want a podcast and with an RSS feed or a blog or anything with an RSS feed to populate that author page to refresh and to be a fresh content, which is why Google likes it because it's fresh content.
And one other question that we get all the time, I'm kind of backtracking because I think we had this question is, okay, I would love to be on people's podcasts. How do I get on? How do I get invited? What do I do? So it's a huge question. When I first started, I would go on LinkedIn and I would just type in podcast. And I would look and people who had podcasts, it would come up and I would message them and I would say, hey, I'd love to be a guest on your podcast. And since we had our own, sometimes I would do a swap. Because, if it was a bigger podcast, they'd be like, well, we're booked or you're not perfect. And so I'd say, we'll swap and have you on our podcast. I think everything, 90% to 100%, I got yes. I don't remember ever having a no that we can't have you on, you're not a good fit. So that's a great way to do it. That's a free thing. You can do it yourself or you can have your VA do it because it is kind of a little bit time consuming. But I would go on for like 20 minutes, and pick a few and get an answer and come back. But then there's some great sources and companies that do that. Jen, you want to talk about that? Because you're familiar with those.
Yeah, we've been members and affiliates for podcastguests.com. So it has an S at the end, podcastguests.com. It's kind of hard to say, but that website basically gives you can create a profile, a podcast interviewee profile, and
Mhm.
then they'll feature you on their emails. So they send an email once a week and they'll feature you every so often if you have a profile there. They also send you that email once a week. Not only does it have featured guests, it'll have featured podcasts. So
Yeah.
we've featured our podcast on there before and gotten some amazing people to interview. And so when you get that email, you look through it and say, okay, here's these featured podcasts. Are any of these podcasts something that I should be on? And then if so, then you click on the link, fill out the survey to see if you're a good fit for them to be on their show. So that's one way. When we were at the Podfest, they had so many different companies. Melanie and I have been getting requests for people to be on our show since we've kind of been around for a while. We probably get 3 to 5, maybe even more than that each week of people who want to be on our show. And, we only do, one a week. So it's limited to how many people we can be on our show. But there's a lot of companies that will book you kind of like a VA. So there's Interview of LA, there's Podmatch, there's Pod Booking. There's so many different companies where you're basically paying to play. So you're paying them to book you and to help you to get on the best shows. So you can even tell them, I only want someone that has this many followers. I only want a podcast show that, features this specific niche. So there's a lot of different things you can do when you're hiring someone to book you. And we have a few other people. So we just want to do a shout out. Good morning, Andy.
Andy, great to see you. Just saw him yesterday.
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to mention is, so we're doing a live stream today, right? But now we're going to turn this into a podcast. So whenever you do something live, Q&A, you can always turn it into a podcast. So you're repurposing the content, which I think is really important. So whenever you're creating content, you can always repurpose it. You can turn it into a podcast. You can turn it into YouTube video, put it on LinkedIn. Andy, who just popped in here, he is a master at doing that. He does that all the time. So I know we've given you tons and tons of information today. So you might want to go back and watch this again to write down in case you didn't have your notepad with you. Jenn gave a lot of really great resources. Again, we have our book, Podcast Authorized. It's on Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's everywhere books are sold. It gives you a lot of these tips. A lot of this information is in there. How to make your book into a podcast, your podcast into a book. And we encourage everybody to write a book. We had this conversation in our mastermind yesterday. That's one of the cornerstones of your marketing. It's not the only thing that you do, but it really is such a huge piece of your marketing. When you have that book, like I did tell the story, it was Andy, actually, it was his story of 15 years ago. People are like, when do I get my money back on my book? And I want to tell them it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Your book is going to outlive you. Your book is going to be around when you're not on this planet anymore. It's always going to be here. So for your entire career, it's going to be working for you. So the message is write it sooner as opposed to later, so you can reap the rewards sooner and for a longer period of time. If you're like, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about this book for 10 years. So I want you to think about all the opportunity costs you may have lost by not having a book. All the connections you didn't make because you didn't have a book. So think about all the connections you can make, all the things you can make, all the authority you're going to have, all the media attention you're going to have, all the doors that will open when you have a book. So think if you have a book now, 5 years from now, how it can propel your career versus if you don't have a book, you're going to be on that same treadmill doing the same thing over and over again instead of having all these doors open up for you and fly open for you. So I hope you enjoyed our live stream today.
Yeah, we're going to take off now and we have some interviews to do for our podcast. So we're going to go do that now. And we'll see you next time on Facebook Live, which we do once a month on the second Friday of every month.
Have a great week. Have a great month, everyone. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Hey, are you looking to increase your revenue, build credibility, and elevate your brand? This podcast is brought to you by Elite Online Publishing, an innovative publishing and full spectrum marketing company. They will publish and market your book to make it a #1 bestseller. Becoming an author is the best way to market your business. So contact them at eliteonlinepublishing.com today. All of their authors become #1 bestsellers.